I was 2 weeks away from my dream wedding in Venice when I found the emails. My fiancé Dominic had been with his ex-girlfriend Camille our entire relationship. Every late work night was a lie. Every business trip was time with her. When I confronted him, his cruel words cut deeper than the betrayal. "Camille understands my ambitions better," he said coldly. Then the truth I never saw coming: he had only proposed because my family connections could help his music career. I was never the woman he loved, just a stepping stone for his success. As I drove away in tears that stormy night, my car plunged off a bridge. But instead of death, I got something better. A second chance. This time I won't be the one left behind. This time I'll let him taste success before watching him fall. Ilara Rossi took her final bow as the audience erupted in thunderous applause. Her violin performance at Carnegie Hall had been nothing short of spectacular, a culmination of years dedicated to her craft. As the crowd rose to their feet, Ilara's eyes scanned the sea of faces, searching for the one person who had promised to be there. The seat reserved for her fiancé, Dominic, remained conspicuously empty. Backstage, Ilara checked her phone for the 5th time. No messages, no missed calls. She typed a quick text. "Where are you? Did you make it to the performance?" She stared at the screen, watching the message deliver but remain unread. This wasn't like Dominic. He might be ambitious and career-focused, but he had never missed one of her major performances before. He probably got caught up in a meeting, Ilara told herself, trying to quiet the unease growing in her stomach. His watch company is launching that new line next month. He's been working non-stop. She placed her violin in its case with practiced care, her fingers lingering on the polished wood. This Stradivarius was her most prized possession, a gift from her grandmother who had first recognized Ilara's talent when she was just 6 years old. Unlike her relationship with Dominic, her connection to music had never disappointed her. Her phone buzzed. Finally, a response from Dominic. "Sorry, babe. Meeting ran long. Celebrating with clients now. Don't wait up." Ilara's heart sank. Not even an acknowledgement of her performance, let alone an apology for missing it. Just another excuse. She sighed and slipped her phone back into her purse. 2 weeks until their wedding in Venice, and lately it felt like they were drifting further apart rather than growing closer. The next morning, Ilara busied herself with wedding preparations. Their apartment was strewn with fabric swatches, seating charts, and travel itineraries. As she moved Dominic's suit jacket from the couch to the closet, a folded piece of paper slipped from the pocket. Normally, she would have simply returned it, respecting his privacy, but something made her pause. She unfolded the paper to find a hotel receipt from the Belvedere, dated 3 days ago when Dominic had claimed to be in Chicago for business. "This doesn't make sense," Ilara muttered, her brows furrowing as she studied the receipt. The Belvedere was a local hotel, barely 15 minutes from their apartment. Why would Dominic need a hotel room so close to home? And why would he lie about being in Chicago? When Dominic returned home that evening, Ilara confronted him with the receipt. His reaction was immediate and defensive. "Are you going through my things now?" he snapped, snatching the paper from her hand. It was a last-minute change of plans. The Chicago meeting got canceled, so I hosted the clients here instead. The company put them up at the Belvedere and I signed for the room. It's no big deal. His explanation seemed plausible, yet something in his eyes, a flicker of something cold and calculating, made Ilara uneasy. She'd never seen that look before, or perhaps she had and had simply chosen not to recognize it. "I'm sorry," she said, backing down. "I was just confused. You told me you were in Chicago, and then I found this." Dominic's expression softened, but only slightly. "It's called business, Ilara. Plans change. You can't expect me to update you on every little detail." He pressed a quick kiss to her forehead before heading to the shower, effectively ending the conversation. In the days that followed, Ilara noticed other discrepancies in Dominic's behavior. Phone calls that he took in another room, speaking in hushed tones. Work commitments that didn't align with what his assistant had mentioned when she called the office. Small inconsistencies that on their own might mean nothing, but together formed a picture that Ilara was reluctant to see clearly. Her friend Valerie noticed the change in Ilara's demeanor during their lunch date. "You seem distracted," Valerie observed, stirring her iced tea. "Wedding jitters." Ilara hesitated before confiding in her friend about the hotel receipt and her growing concerns. "I'm probably overthinking things," she concluded. "Dominic works hard. He's ambitious. Maybe I'm just feeling neglected because of the wedding stress. Valerie's expression grew serious. Alara, I didn't want to say anything, but I saw Dominic last week. He was at Café Lucien and he wasn't alone. She reached across the table to squeeze Alara's hand. He was with a woman. They looked intimate. That could have been anyone. Alara protested. A colleague, a client. He was holding her hand, Alara, and it wasn't just a friendly gesture. Valerie's eyes were filled with concern. I know you don't want to hear this, but as your friend I had to tell you. Alara pulled her hand away, suddenly defensive. You're just being protective. Dominic and I are getting married in 2 weeks. He wouldn't do that to me. But that night, as Dominic slept beside her, Alara couldn't shake Valerie's words. She slipped out of bed and with trembling hands opened Dominic's laptop. She had never invaded his privacy like this before, but the doubt had become too overwhelming to ignore. What she found shattered her world. Emails between Dominic and a woman named Camille, spanning their entire 3-year relationship. Intimate messages, plans for rendezvous, declarations of love. The evidence was undeniable. Dominic had been living a double life, seeing his ex-girlfriend on the same nights he claimed to be working late. Alara read through the emails with growing horror. In one, Dominic had written to Camille on the night of their engagement. It's just for show. You know you're the only one who has my heart. Alara's family connections will help my career, and once I've established myself, we can be together openly. The betrayal was complete. Everything had been a lie, his love, his commitment, even his proposal. Alara had been nothing more than a stepping stone for his ambitions. 2 days later, Alara confronted Dominic with the evidence. They stood in their living room, the printed emails spread across the coffee table between them. For once, Dominic didn't attempt to deny or deflect. Instead, he regarded her with a cool detachment that chilled Alara to the bone. Camille understands my ambitions better, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. She always has. She knows what it takes to succeed in this industry. And I don't. Alara whispered, her voice breaking. I've sacrificed just as much for my career. I've worked just as hard. Dominic's laugh was cruel. Your family handed you everything on a silver platter. That Stradivarius, the connections, the opportunities. I had to fight for every scrap of recognition. He gestured to the emails. Yes, I've been seeing Camille. Yes, I proposed to you primarily because your family connections could advance my career. Is that what you wanted to hear? Ilara's world collapsed around her. Every memory, every moment they had shared, was now tainted by the truth. 2 weeks before their wedding, the man she thought she knew, the man she had planned to spend her life with, had revealed himself to be a stranger. Without another word, Alara grabbed her purse and car keys. She needed to get away from him, away from the apartment that suddenly felt like a stage set for a play in which she had unwittingly been cast. As she drove through the pouring rain, tears blinding her vision, she didn't notice the curve in the road until it was too late. Her car hydroplaned, crashing through the guardrail and plunging off the bridge into the dark waters below. As the car began to sink, Alara's final desperate thought was a wish, a plea for a second chance to do things differently. The water rushed in, cold and unforgiving, and as consciousness began to fade, she closed her eyes, surrendering to the darkness. Alara gasped awake to the shrill sound of her old alarm clock, the one with the cracked plastic case she had replaced years ago. Her heart raced as she took in her surroundings, disoriented by the familiar yet distant details of her former apartment. The small studio with exposed brick walls and the window that never quite closed properly. The place she had lived before moving in with Dominic. What is happening? She whispered, her voice trembling as she reached for her phone on the nightstand. The date displayed on the screen made her blood run cold. May 15, 8 years in the past. The very day she had first met Dominic at her friend's gallery opening. Alara sat up slowly, pressing her palms against her eyes as fragments of memory flooded back. The confrontation with Dominic, the emails, the storm, the bridge. The water filling her lungs as her car sank into darkness. I died, she realized, her fingers tracing the outline of her very much alive body. I died, and somehow I came back. She moved through her apartment in a daze, touching familiar objects that she hadn't seen in years. The chipped mug from her conservatory days. The old practice violin she had retired after receiving her grandmother's Stradivarius. The framed photo of her parents at her first recital. When she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror, Alara almost screamed. Gone were the subtle lines that had begun to form around her eyes. Her hair was shorter, styled in the way she had worn it 8 years ago. She was 25 again, standing at the threshold of a career that had been promising but ultimately compromised by her devotion to Dominic. Second chance, she murmured, recalling her final desperate wish as the water had engulfed her. I've been given a second chance. Once the initial shock subsided, Alara approached her rebirth methodically. She sat at her small kitchen table with a notebook, listing the critical moments in her past life. The fellowship she had declined because Dominic had convinced her it would strain their new relationship. The touring opportunity she had passed on because it conflicted with his watch company's launch event. The collaborative projects she had abandoned to support his career milestones. Each decision, viewed through the lens of her new knowledge, revealed a pattern of self-sacrifice that had ultimately led to her professional stagnation and personal heartbreak. Alara drew a line through each mistake, determined not to repeat them in this second life. Her phone buzzed with a text from her friend Jasmine. Don't forget gallery opening tonight at 8. Wear something fabulous. You're playing a short set, remember? Alara's breath caught. This was it. The night she had first met Dominic. The beginning of what would become 3 years of deception and betrayal. She spent the afternoon practicing her violin, losing herself in the music as she had before Dominic had entered her life. The pure joy of creation, unfettered by thoughts of how her performance might benefit someone else's career or reputation. When she finally set down her bow, Alara felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. As evening approached, she deliberately chose an outfit different from the one she had worn in her past life. Instead of the demure blue dress Dominic had later told her had caught his eye, she selected a bold red jumpsuit that made her feel confident and powerful. Jasmine's gallery was buzzing with activity when Alara arrived. She recognized many faces from her past life, people whose trajectories had intersected with hers in ways both significant and mundane. It was surreal to see them all again, unaware of the history they had shared in a timeline that now existed only in her memory. Alara sipped a glass of champagne as she surveyed the room, her eyes eventually landing on Dominic. He was exactly as she remembered from their first meeting, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his smile calculated to charm. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, laughing at appropriate moments, his eyes constantly assessing who might be useful to him. She watched him work the room, using the same lines and gestures that had once captivated her. I've always believed that art should challenge us, he was saying to a gallery patron, a phrase Alara had heard him repeat countless times over the years. With her new perspective, she could see the performance for what it was, a carefully crafted persona designed to impress and manipulate. When Dominic finally made his way to her side of the room, Alara was prepared. She saw the moment he noticed her, the slight pause in his conversation, the way his eyes lingered on her. In her past life, she had been flattered by his attention, unaware of the calculation behind it. I don't believe we've met, Dominic said, extending his hand just as he had before. I'm Dominic Vance. Alara took his hand briefly, then let go. Alara Rossi, she replied with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Excuse me, I need to prepare for my performance. She walked away without a backward glance, leaving Dominic visibly confused by her lack of interest. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. In this new life, she would not fall under his spell. After her performance, a short but moving piece by Debussy, Alara was approached by a representative from the Maxwell Fellowship, the prestigious opportunity she had declined in her past life. Ms. Rossi, your performance was exceptional, the woman said, handing Alara her card. We're still accepting applications for the Fall Fellowship. I would strongly encourage you to apply. Alara took the card, remembering how she had initially been excited about the opportunity before Dominic had subtly discouraged her. It's so far away, he had said. Long distance is hard on new relationships. There will be other fellowships. Thank you, Alara said firmly. I'll definitely apply. The next morning, Alara called the fellowship committee and submitted her application. As she hung up the phone, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Her new path had begun. Over the following weeks, Alara made deliberate, choices to steer her life in a different direction. She accepted invitations she had previously declined, reconnected with friends she had lost touch with while focused on Dominic, and threw herself into her music with renewed passion. When Dominic attempted to contact her, sending flowers to her apartment with a note suggesting they meet for coffee, Ilara politely declined. She could see now what she had missed before, the careful escalation of his pursuit, the way he had made her feel special while simultaneously isolating her from other opportunities. The day the Maxwell Fellowship acceptance letter arrived, Ilara sat on her couch and wept with relief. In her past life, this path had been closed to her. Now it represented not just a professional opportunity, but a symbolic break from the future that had nearly destroyed her. As she packed for her year abroad, Ilara felt a sense of freedom she had never experienced before. She was no longer bound by the expectations and manipulations that had once defined her relationship with Dominic. In this new life, she would prioritize her own dreams and ambitions. She would build a career based on her talent and hard work, not on compromises made to accommodate someone else's ego. The night before her departure, Ilara stood by her window, looking out at the city that had been both the backdrop to her greatest heartbreak and the setting for her rebirth. She thought of Dominic, wondering briefly if he would pursue her in this timeline as he had in the last. But it didn't matter. She was no longer the same woman who had fallen for his charm and lies. This time she promised herself, "I choose me." 3 years into her second chance at life, Ilara stood backstage at the Salzburg Festival, her Stradivarius tucked securely under her arm. The journey from her reawakening to this moment had been filled with deliberate choices and hard-won achievements, each step taking her further from the path she had traveled in her previous life. The Maxwell Fellowship had been transformative, providing Ilara with mentorship from renowned musicians and performance opportunities across Europe. Unlike her first life, where she had declined the fellowship to stay close to Dominic, this time she had embraced the experience fully, forming connections with fellow artists who valued her talent rather than what she could do for them. 5 minutes, Ms. Rossi, the stage manager called, clipboard in hand. Ilara nodded, taking a deep breath to center herself. Tonight's performance was particularly significant, not just because of the prestigious venue, but because it marked the 3rd anniversary of her rebirth. 3 years since she had awakened in her old apartment, given a second chance to rewrite her story. As she stepped onto the stage, the spotlight illuminating her crimson gown, Ilara felt a surge of gratitude. The audience fell silent as she positioned her violin, her posture confident and relaxed. When she began to play Paganini's Caprice No. 24, her fingers danced across the strings with technical precision and emotional depth that had been absent in her previous life, where anxiety about Dominic's approval had often clouded her performances. After the performance, as Ilara accepted congratulations from festival attendees, a man approached her with genuine admiration in his eyes. "That was extraordinary," he said, his Italian accent softening his words. "You brought new life to a piece I've heard countless times." Ilara smiled, extending her hand. "Thank you. I'm Ilara Rossi." "Lorenzo Moretti," he replied, his handshake warm and firm. "I'm a composer. I've been working on a piece for violin and piano that I think would suit your style perfectly." In her previous life, Ilara might have politely declined, wary of committing to projects that could interfere with her availability for Dominic. But this Ilara recognized an opportunity for creative collaboration based on mutual respect. "I'd love to hear it," she said, and the genuine smile that spread across Lorenzo's face confirmed she had made the right choice. Their collaboration began professionally, meeting several times over the following months to refine the composition. Lorenzo was respectful of her interpretations, eager for her input and passionate about the music in a way that reminded Ilara why she had fallen in love with the violin in the first place. As their professional relationship deepened into friendship, Ilara found herself opening up to Lorenzo about her ambitions and creative vision in ways she never had with Dominic. Lorenzo listened without judgment, offering encouragement and honest feedback that pushed her growth as an artist. "You play as if you've lived multiple lifetimes," Lorenzo observed one evening as they shared a bottle of wine after a particularly intense rehearsal. "There's a depth to your interpretation that feels almost impossible for someone our age." Ilara nearly choked on her wine, wondering how close Lorenzo had come to guessing her impossible truth. "Perhaps I have," she replied lightly, changing the subject. 6 months into their collaboration, Alara received an invitation to perform at an industry event in New York. According to the invitation, several prominent figures in the classical music world would be attending, including Dominic Vance, whose career had been steadily rising over the past few years. Alara traced the embossed lettering of his name on the invitation, a strange mix of emotions stirring within her. In her previous life, they would have been engaged by now, her career taking a backseat to his ambitions. But in this timeline, they had barely interacted beyond that first brief introduction at the gallery opening. Despite her misgivings, Alara accepted the invitation. She had spent 3 years building a life and career independent of Dominic's influence, and she refused to let his presence dictate her professional choices. The event was held at a luxurious hotel in Manhattan, the ballroom transformed into an elegant concert space. As Alara mingled with other musicians before her performance, she felt his presence before she saw him. Turning slowly, she found Dominic watching her from across the room, his expression a mixture of recognition and calculation. He was exactly as she remembered, yet somehow less intimidating than before. His tailored suit and practiced smile no longer held the power to make her heart race or cloud her judgment. Instead, she saw him clearly for what he was, a talented musician whose ambition had twisted into something manipulative and cold. Alara Rossi, Dominic said as he approached, his voice smooth as silk. "I've been following your career with interest. Your rise has been quite impressive." Alara met his gaze steadily. "Thank you. I've been fortunate to work with some incredible musicians. I remember meeting you briefly at a gallery opening years ago," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to reconcile the confident woman before him with the more reserved musician he had barely noticed then. "You were talented even then, but now you've become a force in the industry." "Life takes unexpected turns," Alara replied, maintaining her composure despite the surreal nature of the conversation. This man had once been the center of her world, the cause of her greatest pain, and now he was a stranger looking at her with new eyes. "Indeed it does," Dominic agreed, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I'm actually working on a new project that might interest you. Perhaps we could discuss it over dinner." And there it was, the beginning of the same pattern that had ensnared her before. Alara recognized the calculated interest, the way his gaze assessed her not just as a musician but as a potential asset. In her previous life, she would have been flattered by his attention, eager to impress him. Now she saw through the facade to the opportunist beneath. "I'm afraid my schedule is quite full," she said politely but firmly. "But I wish you all the best with your project." Dominic's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "Of course, perhaps another time." As she walked away, Alara felt a sense of power she had never experienced in her previous life. She had faced her manipulator and remained unmoved by his charm. But more importantly, she recognized that Dominic's presence in her life, even as a distant figure, could serve a purpose in her reborn existence. Over the following months, as Alara's collaboration with Lorenzo flourished and her solo career continued to rise, Dominic's attempts to connect with her became more persistent. Invitations to exclusive events, offers of professional collaboration, even flowers delivered to her dressing room after performances. This time, Alara did not fall for his charm, but she did not completely shut him out either. She maintained a professional distance while carefully observing his behavior, noting how his interest in her seemed to grow a direct proportion to her success and industry connections. When Lorenzo questioned her about Dominic's attention, Alara was honest. "He's someone from my past in a way," she explained. "Someone who taught me a valuable lesson about recognizing people's true intentions." Lorenzo's eyes softened with understanding. "You don't have to explain. We all have ghosts that follow us." If only he knew how literal that statement was in her case. Alara thought as she squeezed his hand gratefully. As Alara's 30th birthday approached, marking the midpoint of her second chance at life, she found herself at a crossroads. Her career was thriving, her friendship with Lorenzo had deepened into something that felt like the beginnings of love, and her relationships with other musicians were built on genuine mutual respect. Yet a part of her remained focused on ensuring that Dominic could never harm another woman as he had harmed her. It wasn't vengeance she sought, but prevention. In her previous life, she had witnessed the devastating consequences of his manipulation firsthand. In this life, she was uniquely positioned to ensure history did not repeat itself. Ilara smiled to herself as she prepared for her next performance. She had been reborn into a second chance, and she intended to make the most of it, not just for herself but for all the women who might otherwise fall victim to Dominic's calculated charm. This time, she would be the one to set the stage, and Dominic would never see the final act coming until it was too late. The opportunity Ilara had been waiting for arrived in the form of a glossy invitation, hand-delivered to her apartment. Dominic was proposing a career-making collaboration, a series of performances across major European venues that would showcase both their talents. The accompanying note was handwritten, personal. "Ilara, we would be unstoppable together. Your artistic interpretation combined with my conducting vision could create something truly extraordinary. Say yes." She traced her fingers over his signature, remembering how she had once treasured notes like these, believing they represented genuine admiration rather than calculated opportunity. Now she understood them for what they were, bait. Ilara called Dominic the next day, agreeing to meet to discuss the collaboration. She chose a public cafe near her rehearsal space, arriving early to select a table where she could observe him before he saw her. When he entered, she noted how his eyes scanned the room, assessing everyone present before spotting her. The smile that spread across his face was practiced, perfect. To anyone else, it might have seemed genuine. "I'm thrilled you agreed to meet," Dominic said, sliding into the chair across from her. "This project could be transformative for both our careers." Ilara nodded, maintaining a professional demeanor. "The program you've proposed is ambitious. 4 countries in 3 months, with original compositions interspersed with classical pieces." Ambitious is exactly right. Dominic leaned forward, his eyes alight with the passion that had once captivated her. The classical music world needs something fresh, something that pushes boundaries while honoring tradition. With your interpretive skills and my conducting approach, we could redefine contemporary classical performance. As Dominic outlined his vision, Ilara listened carefully, not just to his words but to what remained unsaid. The venues he had selected were prestigious, the kind that required connections to secure. The program emphasized his original compositions while positioning her as the interpreter rather than an equal collaborator. Most tellingly, he had already secured initial funding from patrons he described as close personal friends, an indication of how confident he was in her acceptance. "I'm intrigued," Ilara said finally, keeping her tone measured. "But I would need to be involved in all artistic decisions, including program selection and interpretation." A flicker of annoyance crossed Dominic's face before he masked it with agreement. Of course, this would be a true collaboration. By the end of their meeting, Ilara had positioned herself as essential to the project while gaining access to Dominic's professional circle. She agreed to attend a dinner the following week with potential sponsors, a step that would allow her to observe how he operated in his element. That evening, as Ilara related the meeting to Lorenzo during their scheduled rehearsal, his brow furrowed with concern. "There's something about this project that doesn't sit right with me," Lorenzo said, setting down his pencil. "Or perhaps it's just Dominic himself. The way he looks at you, it's possessive somehow." Ilara smiled, touched by Lorenzo's protectiveness. "I know exactly who Dominic is," she assured him. "This collaboration serves a purpose. Trust me." What she couldn't tell Lorenzo was that her investigation had already begun. Through careful conversation with mutual acquaintances and discreet inquiries, Ilara had confirmed that Dominic was still involved with Camille, the same woman he had betrayed her with in her previous life. Their relationship followed the same pattern as before, conducted in private while Dominic maintained a public image of dedicated bachelorhood. More disturbing were the stories Ilara uncovered from other women in the industry. A violist who had abruptly left a prestigious quartet after Dominic had promised her a solo career, then abandoned her when a more advantageous connection came along. A young conductor whose innovative techniques Dominic had incorporated into his own style without credit after their brief relationship ended. A pattern emerged of professional relationships that turned personal, followed by betrayal and career setbacks for the women involved. The dinner with potential sponsors proved even more illuminating. Seated beside a wealthy patron's wife, Ilara listened as the woman confided, "Dominic is quite the charmer. He convinced my husband to fund his last project by suggesting an exclusive performance at our anniversary party. The performance never happened, of course. There was always some excuse." Ilara nodded sympathetically. "That must have been disappointing." It was more than that, the woman continued, her voice low. I later discovered he had made similar promises to at least 3 other patrons. It's a pattern with him. By the time dessert was served, Alara had gathered enough information to confirm her suspicions. Dominic's career advancement had been built on a foundation of manipulation and broken promises, leaving a trail of disappointed patrons and heartbroken women in his wake. As the collaboration progressed into rehearsals, Alara maintained her professional distance while allowing Dominic to believe his charm was working. She attended the social events that surrounded the project, watching as he worked the room with calculated precision, always aware of who could advance his career. It was at one such event that Dominic revealed his ultimate goal. After several glasses of champagne had loosened his usual careful control, he confided in Alara about an upcoming opportunity. The National Symphony is looking for a new principal conductor, he said, his voice hushed with excitement. The selection committee will be attending the final performance of our tour. This collaboration, with your name attached to it, could be what secures me the position. Alara nodded, feigning enthusiasm while inwardly recognizing this as the perfect opportunity to set her plan in motion. It sounds like everything is coming together for you. Dominic smiled, reaching for her hand across the table. For us, Alara, I've come to value not just your musical talent but your presence in my life. I've been thinking that perhaps our partnership could extend beyond the professional. There it was, the next step in his pattern, right on schedule. Alara allowed herself to appear slightly flustered, as if his interest had caught her by surprise. Dominic, we should focus on the collaboration for now. Of course, he agreed smoothly. But I hope you'll consider what I've said. We understand each other in a way few people could. Later that night, alone in her apartment, Alara opened her laptop and added this latest development to the detailed documentation she had been compiling. For months, she had meticulously gathered evidence of Dominic's manipulations, from screenshots of communications to testimony from previous partners. It was all there, a comprehensive record of his pattern of using romantic relationships for professional gain. She closed the file, titled simply Truth, and leaned back in her chair. The trap was nearly set. All that remained was to determine the most effective moment for its release. The next morning, Alara met Lorenzo for coffee before his flight to Berlin, where he was premiering a new composition. Their relationship had deepened during the months of Alara's investigation, evolving from friendship into something more profound. Unlike her relationship with Dominic, which had been built on calculation and control, her connection with Lorenzo was founded on mutual respect and genuine admiration. I'll miss you, Lorenzo said, his fingers intertwined with hers across the table. Berlin won't be the same without you. Alara smiled, feeling a warmth that had been absent in her previous life. It's only for a week, and when you return, we'll celebrate the success of your premiere. Lorenzo hesitated, his expression growing serious. Before I go, I wanted to ask about the gala next month. The one celebrating the end of your collaboration with Dominic. What about it? Alara asked, though she suspected what was coming. I've heard rumors that Dominic is planning something dramatic. A public proposal, perhaps. Lorenzo's eyes reflected his concern. I know it's not my place, but I care about you too much to stay silent. Alara squeezed his hand reassuringly. Lorenzo, I promise you have nothing to worry about. I know exactly who Dominic is and what he's planning. Trust me when I say I'm not in any danger of falling under his spell. Lorenzo's relief was visible. I do trust you, I just don't trust him. As they said their goodbyes at the taxi stand, Lorenzo pulled Alara into a gentle embrace. Whatever you're planning with this collaboration, be careful. Men like Dominic don't react well to losing control. Alara nodded, touched by his perception. I will. And Lorenzo, thank you for being someone I can trust. After Lorenzo's departure, Alara returned to her apartment to finalize preparations for the upcoming gala. The event had been Dominic's idea, a celebration marking the conclusion of their successful collaboration and coinciding with the visit from the National Symphony Selection Committee. What Dominic didn't know was that Alara had made some additions to the evening's program. She opened the file containing her evidence once more, reviewing each item with careful attention. The stories formed a pattern too consistent to be coincidence, too damaging to be ignored. Women whose careers had been derailed, patrons who had been deceived, promises broken in the pursuit of advancement. Alara closed her laptop with a sense of purpose. In her previous life, she had been one of Dominic's victims, her heart broken and her career compromised by his betrayal. In this life, she would ensure he could never harm another woman with his manipulations. The gala would be not just the end of their collaboration, but the conclusion of Dominic's pattern of deception. She picked up her violin, losing herself in practice as she prepared for the most important performance of her reborn life. The piece she had composed, titled Phoenix, would serve as both her statement of rebirth and the backdrop for Dominic's downfall. Every note had been carefully crafted to tell the story of betrayal and resurrection that only she fully understood. The night of the gala arrived with a sense of inevitability. Ilara stood before her mirror, smoothing the folds of her stunning blue gown, the exact shade she would have worn at their Venice wedding in her previous life. The symmetry felt appropriate for what she was about to do. Her phone chimed with a message from Lorenzo, who had returned from Berlin the previous day. "You look beautiful tonight, I'm certain. Remember, I'm here if you need me." Ilara smiled, sending back a heart emoji before slipping her phone into her evening bag alongside a small USB drive that contained everything she had compiled over the past months. Tonight would be the culmination of her second chance, not just personal redemption but protection for all the women who might otherwise fall victim to Dominic's calculated charm. The venue was spectacular, a historic concert hall transformed with elegant lighting and floral arrangements. As Ilara entered, she noted how the space had been designed to highlight Dominic's achievement rather than their collaborative effort. His name appeared first on all the promotional materials, his portrait more prominently displayed, a small detail but revealing of his true priorities. Dominic spotted her immediately, crossing the room with confident strides. He looked impeccable in his tuxedo, the picture of success and charm. To anyone else, his warm smile might have seemed genuine, his eyes filled with admiration rather than calculation. "You look stunning," he said, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her cheek. "Tonight is perfect." The National Symphony Committee members are already here, and they're impressed with what they've seen so far. Ilara returned his smile with practiced ease. "Everything has come together beautifully. There's just one final touch to make the evening complete," Dominic added, his voice dropping to an intimate tone. "A surprise I think you'll appreciate." She knew exactly what he meant. The engagement ring hidden in his pocket, the public proposal designed to cement his image as a romantic visionary at the precise moment the selection committee was making their decision. In her previous life, she would have been overwhelmed by such a gesture, blind to the manipulation behind it. "I look forward to it," she replied, her composure perfect. As they circulated among the guests, Ilara observed Dominic in his element, working the room with practiced charm. She noted how he subtly adjusted his conversation for each person, emphasizing his artistic vision with the selection committee, discussing financial opportunities with potential patrons, and sharing amusing industry anecdotes with fellow musicians. It was a masterful performance, one she had once mistaken for genuine connection. When it came time for her performance, Ilara took center stage with serene confidence. The audience fell silent as she positioned her violin, her posture elegant against the backdrop of subtle blue lighting. "Tonight I'll be performing an original composition titled Phoenix," she announced, her voice clear and strong. "It's a piece about betrayal and rebirth, about rising from the ashes of what was lost to create something more beautiful than before." From her position on stage, Ilara could see Dominic's expression shift subtly from pride to confusion. This wasn't part of the program they had agreed upon. Before he could process the change, Ilara began to play. The music started softly, a melancholy melody that spoke of love and trust, before shifting into dissonant notes that represented betrayal. As the piece progressed, the melody transformed, growing stronger and more triumphant, a musical representation of her own journey from devastation to empowerment. When the final note resonated through the hall, there was a moment of complete silence before the audience erupted in thunderous applause. Dominic was the first to reach her as she left the stage, his smile fixed but his eyes wary. "That was unexpected, but beautiful," he said, his voice tight. The committee was clearly moved. Ilara nodded. "Music should reveal truth, don't you think? Speaking of which, I believe I'm scheduled to say a few words about our collaboration." Before Dominic could object, Ilara approached the podium. The audience quieted as she adjusted the microphone. Thank you all for being here to celebrate the conclusion of this collaborative project, she began, her voice warm and engaging. The past months have taught me much about music, partnership, and authenticity in art. She paused, looking directly at the selection committee members seated in the front row. In preparing for tonight, I've been reflecting on what makes a true leader in the classical music world. Is it technical skill and innovative interpretation? Certainly, but equally important is integrity, consistency between public persona and private actions. Dominic shifted uncomfortably at the side of the stage, his hand moving to the pocket that contained the engagement ring. Alara continued without faltering. Recently, I've become aware of certain industry figures who build careers through manipulation and falsehood. Artists who present one face to the public while engaging in patterns of deception behind closed doors. She gestured subtly, and on the screens throughout the venue, images began to appear. Screenshots of communications, testimony from previous partners, documentation of simultaneous relationships, all presented tastefully but undeniably as examples of inauthenticity in our industry. Though Dominic was never directly named, the evidence clearly pointed to him. As artists, we have a responsibility to our audiences, our patrons, and our collaborators to operate with transparency and honesty. Alara continued as murmurs spread through the crowd. That's why tonight, I'm announcing the establishment of a foundation to support artists who have been manipulated or sidelined by powerful figures in our industry. From the audience, several women rose to their feet, former partners of Dominic whom Alara had contacted during her investigation. I'm pleased to introduce the inaugural board members of the Authentic Voice Foundation, Alara announced, acknowledging each woman with a nod. The audience's reaction was a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The selection committee members exchanged concerned glances, their earlier enthusiasm visibly cooling as they connected the dots. Dominic's face had gone pale, his expression shifting from confusion to fury as he realized what was happening. As Alara concluded her speech to polite but subdued applause, she could feel the shift in the room. The narrative had changed. No longer was this a celebration of Dominic's genius and vision. Instead, it had become a moment of reckoning, of truth emerging from carefully constructed fiction. Backstage, Dominic cornered her, his charm completely evaporated. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, his voice low but vibrating with anger. "You've completely undermined everything we've built." Alara met his gaze calmly. "I haven't undermined anything, Dominic. I've simply revealed the truth." "Truth?" he scoffed. "You publicly humiliated me in front of the selection committee. My chance at the National Symphony is gone, just as my chance at a genuine relationship was gone the moment you decided to use me as a stepping stone." Alara replied, her voice steady. "Did you think I wouldn't find out about Camille? About all the others?" Dominic's eyes widened in shock. "How could you possibly know about Camille?" "I know everything, Dominic. I know about the promises you've broken, the careers you've derailed, the hearts you've manipulated to advance your own ambitions." Alara stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm living my second chance, and I refuse to be anyone's stepping stone. Not again." "Again?" Dominic repeated, confusion momentarily displacing his anger. "What are you talking about?" "It doesn't matter," Alara said, turning to leave. "What matters is that you won't be able to use your charm and position to manipulate women anymore. Your reputation will recover eventually, but people will be watching now. They'll be careful." As she walked away, Dominic called after her, his voice a mixture of fury and desperation. "You've made a serious mistake, Alara. You have no idea what I could have offered you." Alara paused, looking back over her shoulder. "I know exactly what you would have offered, Dominic. A life built on lies, just as before, but this time I chose differently." She left him standing there, confusion and anger battling across his features. As she moved through the crowd toward the exit, several women approached her, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of fierce approval. They were Dominic's former partners, the women who had shared their stories for Alara's presentation. "Thank you," one whispered, squeezing Alara's hand. "He did the same thing to me 3 years ago. I thought I was alone." Another nodded in agreement. "I left the industry because of him. Thought no one would believe me over the great Dominic Vance." Alara embraced each woman in turn, feeling a sense of completion that transcended personal revenge. This was why she had been given a second chance, not just to avoid her own heartbreak, but to prevent others from experiencing the same pain. Outside the venue, Lorenzo was waiting beside a taxi, his expression a mixture of concern and admiration. "I saw what happened," he said as Ilara approached. "Are you okay?" She nodded, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the evening. "I am now." "I didn't understand before," Lorenzo admitted as he opened the taxi door for her. "But now I do. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth." Ilara smiled, touched by his perception. "It was about both," she said softly. "And about making sure he couldn't hurt anyone else the way he hurt me." As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Ilara looked back at the venue one last time. Inside, Dominic was likely still reeling from the public unraveling of his carefully constructed image. But outside in this moment, she was free from the weight of her past life's pain. Her rebirth was complete, her second chance fully realized. Lorenzo's hand found hers in the darkness of the taxi. "Where to?" he asked. "Forward," Ilara replied, squeezing his fingers gently. "Always forward." 1 year after the gala that had forever altered the classical music landscape, Ilara stood in the bright spring sunshine outside a renovated community center in Brooklyn. A large banner hung above the entrance. "Authentic Voice Music Education Program, Grand Opening." Children clutching instrument cases filed through the doors, their excited chatter filling the air. Parents followed, many stopping to thank Ilara personally for creating this opportunity for their children. "Ms. Rossi, my daughter has been counting down the days," one mother said, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We could never have afforded private lessons." Ilara smiled, warmth spreading through her chest as she watched the young girl carefully carrying a violin case nearly as large as she was. "That's exactly why we're here," she replied. Talent shouldn't be limited by circumstance. The Authentic Voice Foundation had grown beyond Ilara's initial vision. What had begun as an organization to support artists who had been manipulated or sidelined had expanded to include educational programs, mentorship opportunities, and community outreach. The Education Center was the latest addition, providing free music instruction to children from underserved communities. Lorenzo appeared at her side, a clipboard in hand. "The first classes are about to begin," he said, his voice warm with pride. "The teachers are ready, and the students are practically vibrating with excitement." Ilara leaned into him briefly, drawing strength from his steady presence. Their relationship had deepened over the past year, evolving from professional collaboration to personal partnership. Unlike her relationship with Dominic, which had been built on calculation and control, what she shared with Lorenzo was founded on mutual respect and genuine affection. He had supported her vision for the foundation without trying to make it his own, offering guidance when asked but never imposing his will. "I should go inside," Ilara said, reluctant to leave the peaceful moment. "I promised to speak to the students before their first lesson." Lorenzo kissed her temple gently. "Go inspire them. I'll finish up the paperwork with the contractors." Inside, the community center had been transformed. Practice rooms lined the corridors, each equipped with quality instruments and sound treatment. The main hall had been converted into a small performance space, with rows of chairs facing a modest stage. It was here that Ilara found the students gathered, their faces turned expectantly toward her as she entered. "Welcome to the Authentic Voice Music Education Program," she began, smiling at their eager expressions. "Today marks the beginning of a journey that I hope will bring you as much joy as music has brought me." As she spoke about the transformative power of music, about discipline and expression, and the unique voice each of them possessed, Ilara felt a sense of purpose that had been missing in her previous life. This was why she had been given a second chance, not just to avoid her own heartbreak, but to create something meaningful from the pain of her past. After her speech, as the students dispersed to their assigned classrooms, Ilara noticed a familiar figure standing at the back of the hall. Dominic Vance watched her with an unreadable expression, his once confident posture now slightly diminished. The past year had not been kind to him. Following the revelations at the gala, the National Symphony position had gone to another conductor, and several of his patrons had withdrawn their support. His career had stalled, though not collapsed entirely, his undeniable talent preventing a complete fall from grace. Ilara approached him calmly, no longer affected by his presence as she once had been. "Dominic, this is unexpected." He nodded, his eyes taking in the renovated space. I heard about the opening. It's an impressive achievement. Thank you, Alara replied, genuinely curious about his presence. But I doubt you came all this way to compliment the foundation. Dominic's smile was tight, a shadow of his former charm. Always direct, aren't you? I came because I wanted to see for myself. The great Alara Rossi, savior of the underrepresented. Despite the edge in his voice, Alara detected something else beneath the bitterness, a reluctant admiration perhaps. Is that so hard to believe? What's hard to believe, Dominic said, lowering his voice, is how thoroughly you read me from the beginning. You knew exactly what I was going to do, every step I would take. It was like you could see the future. Alara maintained her composure, though her heart raced of how close he had come to the impossible truth. Not the future, Dominic, just patterns. You're predictable in your manipulations. He shook his head slowly. No, that doesn't explain it. The way you anticipated my every move, the evidence you collected, the timing of your revelation, it was too perfect. Perhaps I just know you better than you know yourself, Alara suggested, unwilling to engage further on the topic. Was there something specific you wanted? Dominic hesitated, an internal struggle visible on his face. My career hasn't been the same since that night, he finally admitted. The whispers follow me everywhere. No one trusts me with their money or their talent. Even Camille left. I'm sorry about Camille, Alara said, surprised to find she meant it. But the rest, that's the consequence of your choices, not my actions. You're right, Dominic conceded, the admission clearly difficult for him. That's actually why I came. Not to confront you or demand anything, but to understand. How did you avoid becoming bitter? After what I did, which you knew I was capable of, how did you channel it into this? He gestured around at the vibrant educational space. Alara considered her answer carefully. How could she explain that living two lives had given her perspective that most people never achieve? That experiencing the depths of betrayal and then being granted a second chance had taught her that true power lay not in revenge but in creation. When faced with pain, we have two options, she finally said. We can let it harden us, turn us into someone who inflicts the same pain on others, or we can transform it into something that heals. I chose the latter. Dominic nodded slowly, absorbing her words. It suits you, this wisdom. You seem so different from the woman I tried to manipulate. I am different, Alara agreed. We all have the capacity to change, Dominic. Even you. He smiled ruefully. Perhaps, though I suspect my road to redemption will be longer than most. It often is for those who have caused the most damage, Alara replied without rancor. But it's never too late to begin. Their conversation was interrupted by Lorenzo, who approached with a protective air. Everything okay here? He asked, his eyes fixed on Dominic with clear suspicion. Everything's fine, Alara assured him, reaching for his hand. Dominic was just leaving. Dominic's gaze shifted between them, noting their intertwined fingers and the simple engagement ring that now adorned Alara's hand. It was nothing like the ostentatious diamond he had once intended to offer, but a band Lorenzo had designed himself, inspired by the musical notation of the first piece they had created together. Congratulations, Dominic said, genuine despite the circumstances. It seems you found what I could never give you. I did, Alara agreed. Authenticity. As Dominic departed, Lorenzo looked at Alara with concern. Are you all right? I didn't expect to see him here today. Alara smiled, squeezing his hand reassuringly. I'm more than all right. Seeing him now is like looking at a chapter of a book I've already finished. There's no pain left, just lessons learned. Lorenzo kissed her forehead gently. You continue to amaze me with your capacity for growth. Most people would still harbor resentment. Life's too precious to waste on resentment, Alara replied, thinking of her extraordinary second chance. I prefer to focus on what lies ahead. What lay ahead became clear later that afternoon as Alara stood on the small stage of the education center, preparing to perform for the students and their families. As she positioned her violin under her chin, she gazed out at the eager young faces in the audience, at Lorenzo watching proudly from the wings at the life she had built from the ashes of her past. The piece she had chosen was the same one she had played at the gala a year earlier, Phoenix, but she had revised it, adding a final movement that spoke not of revenge but of renewal. As she drew her bow across the strings, the music that filled the hall was triumphant and joyous, a celebration of second chances and lives transformed. When the final note resonated through the space, there was a moment of perfect silence before the audience erupted in applause. Alara closed her eyes, allowing the sound to wash over her. In her first life, she had sought validation through others' approval, particularly Dominic's. Now she found her worth in the music itself, in the community she had built, in the authentic connections she had formed. As she took her final bow, Alara realized that her revenge against Dominic had never been the point. It had merely been a step on her journey towards something far more valuable, a life lived on her own terms, shaped by her choices rather than someone else's manipulation. Her rebirth had given her not just a second chance at love, but a deeper understanding of her own power. Later that evening, as she and Lorenzo walked hand in hand through the quiet streets of Brooklyn, Alara felt a profound sense of peace. The symphony of her second life was playing out in perfect harmony, each note exactly as she had composed it. And unlike the melody of her first life, which had ended in discord and pain, this composition promised to continue with richness and depth for many movements to come. When Lorenzo paused beneath a streetlight to pull her into his arms, his eyes reflecting nothing but genuine adoration, Alara knew with certainty that she had finally found what had eluded her before, a love built on truth rather than calculation, on mutual support rather than exploitation. As their lips met in a tender kiss, the final piece of her second chance fell perfectly into place.